Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted publicly. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I'd like to turn the call over to your host, Erlene Dow.
Thank you, Lisa, for hosting our webinar. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the May Local Employment Dynamics, or LED, webinar. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome a 2022 LED workshop presenter, Dr. Mark White, as he presents Using Census Data to Understand Youth Employment. As the economy recovers from COVID-19, employers throughout Missouri face difficulties in finding workers. Engaging younger workers, both high school students and recent high school graduates, represents one potential solution for addressing this labor shortage. Younger workers often fill many low-wage, part-time, or seasonal jobs. These employment opportunities expose young people to the world of work, allow them to explore potential careers, and enable them to earn money. For recent high school graduates, early employment opportunities may represent first steps in establishing careers. This webinar will examine several key youth employment trends utilizing the longitudinal employer household dynamics, quarterly workforce indicators, and several other publicly available data sources. Dr. Mark White is an Associate Extension Professor and State Specialist in Missouri's Extension's Labor and Workforce Development Program and currently serves as the Interim Director of MU's Extension's Regional Economic and Entrepreneurial Development Exceed program. He has worked with the University of Missouri's Extension since September 2018. During that time, he has worked on a number of applied research and technical assistance projects, including a workforce needs assessment of Missouri's food, agriculture, forestry industries, and a labor market analysis of the St. Louis bioscience industry. Prior to joining the University of Missouri, Dr. White was involved in an economic and workforce development consulting in both a university and nonprofit setting for over 15 years. With that, I welcome Dr. White.
All right, thank you, Arlene. I'm happy to be here as I've been a big fan of the LED program since its early days when there wasn't national coverage or much of a time series. And so it's great to see the program where what it's grown into today and what a useful resource it is. In any case, as Arlene said, today I'm going to talk about trends in youth employment. Now, I work in University Extension, and from an extension perspective, I'm part of what we call our Business and Communities Extension program, which includes our Small Business Development Center and our labor and workforce development programs. And so like issues in terms of like labor shortages and how do we find workers are a real area of big concern. Also within Extension, we have, more broadly, we have the 4-H program, so 4-H youth program. So there's no shortage of kind of internal as well as external interest in this topic. So today I'm going to just to tell you a little bit about what I want to talk about. We're going to look to answer several questions to better understand the issues of youth employment. Those questions include things like how many young people are in the workforce and how has that changed over time? When do young people enter the workforce, particularly when do they fully enter the workforce when they're done with high school? What do young people do when they actually enter the workforce? And then what kind of help can we provide them to make that, that jump into the world of work? Now, to begin answering these questions, I drew, on a lot of different sources. And so it's, I'll use information pulled from the current population survey, the American Community Survey. We have our State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education provides data. And then the quarterly workforce indicators also really helps to answer several really kind of important questions about youth employment. So we certainly draw upon that. Now, as Arlene mentioned in the introduction, youth employment is kind of an important topic, just in the sense that there's a lot of benefits that come from it. For an employer's perspective, young people are often a source of part-time, low wage, or seasonal positions. So they're they fill an important role in the labor force. It also provides, people with just young people just experience, introduces them to the world of work and just what it means to show up to work on time, to work with people that you don't necessarily know, all those kind of, basic things that people need to learn. And then, in some instances, this kind of work can help allow young people to explore potential career options and then prepare themselves careers, down the, as they grow in their careers. So the focus, I'll just give kind of folks a heads up. A lot of the work that's here, I have pulled some national trends, but there's also some work that focuses on Missouri because I work for Missouri Extension. But a lot of what I'm showing here is stuff that can kind of easily be replicated in other states. So hopefully this webinar can be a source of good ideas for you all if you want to explore, similar things. So as a starting point, I think we need to just think about the simple question of how many young people are actually in the workforce and how is this changing over time. And certainly, the answer to that question varies depending on if we're looking at just kind of the tumultuous past couple of years with the pandemic and the kind of the economic consequences that kind of resulting from that. But also over the course of the past couple decades too, because I think that provides some important context as well. Now, I'm of the mindset that some of the demographic shifts that we're experiencing right now are one of the kind of the driving forces in really changing the complexion of the workforce. We hear all about labor shortages, but a lot of what's driving those labor shortages is really, I think what we're feeling is the bite of some of these demographic shifts that we know have been coming for kind of a long time. So, what the graph here, the chart here shows is Missouri's population pyramid. So basically the different, how many people are in different age cohorts in Missouri, and then how has it changed? So the colored bars that you see on the chart, those are what the population in those age cohorts in 2020, and this is using the kind of the 2020 population estimates. And then the kind of the black bars that go around, the empty bars are where we were in 2010. So you can see a little bit of the shift that's going on in terms of the population. So the youngest boomers, the baby boom generation, are now in their late 50s. So it would kind of fall in that 55 to 79 range or so in terms of the age cohort shown on the chart. And so you can see a lot of older folks have left the workforce compared to where they were 10 years ago. As you can see, the colored bars exceed in those age categories exceed those black bars, those empty bars. And so, not only we hear about like the Great Resignation, but a lot of ways it's for a lot of the baby boomers, the pandemic has brought about the Great retirement as well. They finally kind of pushed them out of the workforce. Shifting down to if you're looking for ages between say 50 or 40 and 55, or was Generation X, and we can see that's a lot smaller generation. And I just as a Gen Xer myself, I just want to highlight that. Because we're often forgotten about, like people forget to mention us, but we're used to that though. But anyway, the next generation then is the millennials. And, I think for a long time, we've talked about the millennials as they are they're coming in there as the young people, but the millennials are now 25 to 40 years old, and they're pretty much fully in the workforce. So they're no longer the kids, they are our workforce. And so that turns us to the issue of like, okay, well, let's think about what does it mean for youth employment? And then that next generation, Generation Z, that 10 to 25 year old category. Again, it's smaller than the millennials, so there's fewer people there than there were before. So, why does all this matter? Well, it matters because, as we think about the changing complexion of our workforce, and through sheer numbers alone, Missouri now has 41,000 fewer people aged 10 to 19 than it did in 2010. So, if there's harder to find younger people, well, there's fewer young people. So what does this, what do these demographic shifts mean for the workforce, kind of generally speaking? Well, there's two factors. Is as I kind of mentioned, the first one being that there are now fewer young people that are there, but labor force participation rate can also affect the number of people, young people who are in the workforce. And I think when we look at, this is drawing on the chart that's here is drawing on American Community Survey data from 2006 to 2010, and then 10 years later from 2016 to 2020. We can see that the labor force participation rates amongst young people has declined, even though in Missouri, we tend to be a little bit higher than the nation generally speaking, but that labor force participation rate. So you add in, combine those two things and you add in, the fewer young people and declining labor force participation rates. And then what we can see in Missouri, at least, and I would imagine Missouri is fairly representative for a lot of parts of the country, whether it's in the Midwest or certainly the Northeast. But what we see is that between 2006 and 2010, Missouri's labor force averaged about 168,000 workers, age 16 to 19, and then move ahead 10 years to 2016 to 2020, and that number fell to 143,000 or so. So it's about a 15% drop in a decade's time in terms of just the sheer size of that. Of people that fall in that age cohort. So that's about 24,000 fewer young people. And again, the key point of all of this is that going into the pandemic, because this is where these data take us kind of up to is to the pandemic. But going into the pandemic, one of the reasons why it was harder to find young people to work is because there were simply fewer young people. Now, a lot of these data come from that period leading into the pandemic, but the current population survey can give us more current information, at least at the national level. And so the pandemic was, what the chart here shows is basically an index of employment. So the red line is for all workers in the U.S. age 16 to 17. The purple line is 16 to 19. The blue line is 18 to 19. And then the black line is basically the entire workforce. So age 16 plus, all set to January 2020, kind of right before the pandemic. And I think what you see is that the pandemic was harder for, younger workers for a lot of reasons. And a lot of those reasons being the types of industries they tend to be involved in. And we'll get into that in a bit. But basically what you saw is that since January 2020, by 40% of young workers were out of work in April 2020. So there was a severe drop that was there. Now, those kind of the workers in those age cohorts has been kind of, as with the economy recovers, so too those opportunities come back, and you can see the recovery in youth employment, particularly ages 16 and 17-year-olds, more so than say 18 and 19-year-olds, has really taken off. And it's really taken off, especially since the latter half of 2021. And there's now about 17% more 16 to 17-year-olds in the workforce than there were in January 2020. So, some of this we're getting a little bit into the season, kind of where young people work. They tend to work more in the summer. But it's still significantly higher than we were at the same period in 2021. So youth employment appears to be one of kind of the success stories of the recovery. However, those are kind of recent trends. And so I think it's also important for us to understand some of these trends in just in the greater context. And that means taking a little bit of a longer time horizon to look back at. So, taking this longer view, we can see that even though youth employment has rebounded recently, it's still, and again, these are the same colors. So that red line is ages 16 to 17, setting things back to where we were in the beginning of 2000. It's still 20% lower than it was 20 years ago. And you can see, kind of looking over those past 2 decades, the Great Recession really certainly took a toll on youth employment with a big decline in terms of the numbers. And if we accept that 1996 is the last year for millennials to be born, that means that the last 16 to 17-year-olds in the millennial generation were in 2012 and 2013. And so we can see a little steadier growth in youth employment numbers as Generation Z kind of moves into the workforce. But long story short, we're still down from where we were, 2 decades ago. Now, the CPS numbers, are important. They give us really current data. They give us, what the national picture looks like. But they don't necessarily provide us with the details that we might want at the state level, for instance. So this is an area where we can really turn to the quarterly workforce indicators to give us some more, it's not necessarily the same, but similar information. And so what this chart shows is an index of employment that goes back to 2000 for workers age 14 to 18 and 19 to 21, those kind of different age cohorts that the quarterly workforce indicators provides us. And you see, yes, it's different data sources and different age cohorts, but it tells a somewhat similar story, really to what's, what the CPS was showing, that, you can see the seasonality that's there, but they generally follow similar trends. So there's the big dip during the Great Recession, in here, and then a big increase as we move into, the second and third quarters of 2021, which for us in Missouri, at least, is the most recent data that we have available. And so it'll be interesting to see how that continues, because certainly the national numbers show that big increase continues over the kind of the past 6 months. So, but really what in this case, what the QWI provides for us is a kind of, at least at the state level, it shows that we're following similar trends to what the nation showed. Now, I want to switch gears just a little bit here and think about a different question. And that's, when do young people actually go about entering the workforce? And, a lot of high school students work part-time when they're in high school, but not all high school graduates necessarily fully enter the workforce when they're done with school. So there are other options, such as, post-secondary education. Obviously, there's enlisting in the military, there's taking that, gap year, whatever that may mean. And as a result, before diving into kind of what young people do when they enter the workforce, I want to spend just a bit of time looking at what high school graduates do or choose to do, particularly when they finish high school. And to help answer these questions, we're able to get some information from our State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And so just as a, for folks that aren't in Missouri, or just generally speaking, I find that state departments of education can be good sources of good information about young people. And so it's a good source to mine if you haven't looked. Now, as I said, a good number of students, they do work through high school, but the big kind of choice comes when they leave high school. And do I go to a 4-year university? Do I go to community college? Do I enter the workforce? Do I enlist in the military? And here in Missouri, we can find out what they actually choose to do. And like I said, other states where I've worked have similar kind of information available through their State Department of Education. But so this is based on a 180-day follow-up survey from DESE, or Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And so they basically survey students who, 6 months after they've graduated, and ask them what they've, or if they've left school, and ask them what they're doing. And here in Missouri, we can go back to, we can go back beyond 2000, but I kept it at 2000. And what you see is that top line, which is shows the share of students choosing to go to a 4-year institution, has stayed relatively constant over the past 2 decades, between about 35 and 40%. Now, I will say, as an aside, you pair this consistency with the shrinking population I mentioned before, and that's certainly going to be a challenge for those of us in higher ed, as that means there's just smaller numbers of our kind of traditional student or traditional customers coming into university. But in any case, those numbers tend to be relatively constant. When we look at 2 years, the share of students selecting to go to a 2-year institution or going straight into the workforce, they appear to be a bit more connected to the state of the economy. So when the economy is bad, there's fewer opportunities. So students are more likely to elect to go to school than go straight into the workforce, where there might be a lot more competition from kind of unemployed folks either during the recession or in the recovery coming out of that recession. And then when as the economy improves, there's more opportunities, so more students are likely to enter the workforce. And so, I think what these numbers show is that community college is essentially kind of counter-cyclical. But where we are right now, at least leading into 2000, which was our kind of the most recent data available, that about a quarter of Missouri high school students elected to go straight into the workforce when they were done, and that's as high as it's been in 20 years. So leading into the recession or into the pandemic, the economy's kind of moving along. So it'll be interesting now that, again, with the recovery, what this looks like as we get more data moving forward. Now, I'm a geographer by training, so I think I'm required to include maps. I think it's just part of the contract. And so in any case, I'm always interested in the kind of the spatial variation of some of these different trends. And Missouri, like I said, Missouri is a fairly representative state because it is so diverse as a state. So for those of you who don't know anything about Missouri, we have St. Louis in the east, Kansas City in the west, Springfield in the southwest, and then I'm here in Columbia, Missouri in the middle. North of I-70, which kind of cuts the state in half. East-west is more Midwestern by nature, and then we have the Ozarks in the southeast part of the state. That's kind of more like south and southeast, more like Appalachia, and then the Boot Heel, Missouri Boot Heel, is more like the Missouri Delta. So it's a very kind of diverse state. But in any case, when we're looking at students that go to four-year institutions, and this is probably not surprising, is that it tends to be the share of students choosing to go to 4 years lowest in the Ozarks, which, as I mentioned, is similar to Appalachia, and they're some of our most disadvantaged counties. The share of students going to 4 years is higher in more urban and suburban counties where there are higher overall levels of educational attainment. Again, that's probably not necessarily surprising. For 2-year schools, it has a somewhat different pattern, and some of the places with the greatest shares of students going to community colleges are in areas with strong community colleges. So, we have East Central Community College over here, and State Fair Community College here, and Moberly Area Community College up here. And so, you can kind of pick out where there's opportunity. And I think that, the question of locally available opportunity is kind of, it drives a lot of decisions. And we'll see it when we get into the workforce question and the employment questions, is that, what is locally available can dictate the choices. One of the things that stands out on this map is Northwest Missouri, in part because there is less access to community colleges in that region. The community college that serves that region is kind of is more the north central Missouri, and it's more kind of in the central part than the northwest part. So there's not a lot of locally available community college that's there. Whereas there's also a 4-year kind of regionally serving institution more in Northwest Missouri. So anyway, the big takeaway from kind of highlighting this is that, again, the availabilities or access to opportunities can really dictate choices. And the same thing comes from, when we switch back to, the number of students that choose work, and how does this look different? And what we see is that it's a bit of a mirror image to the maps that I just kind of showed, students choosing post-secondary education, and that there's kind of more grads going directly into the workforce in the Ozarks and the Boot Heel, which, as I mentioned, are some of our kind of more disadvantaged counties. There's also, students from kind of non-metro counties were more likely to directly enter the workforce than those in the metro counties as well. So again, kind of the availability of opportunity can kind of dictate a lot of these choices. So, while these state kind of education data show what share of graduates go into the workforce, this is where the quarterly workforce indicators can really be a helpful source of information by answering kind of the really important question about, well, what kind of work do these students actually go to? So yes, they're entering the workforce, but what do they actually do when they get there? And what the QWI data show actually it tells an interesting story, and in a lot of ways it probably validates what we intuitively already know. So if we look at youth employment by industry, we can see that about half of working people age 14 to 18, so that's the pie chart on the left is age 14 to 18, work in food service and accommodation. And then about another quarter, or 26% or so, are in retail. And this is basically this is the average of last four quarters in Missouri. Again, I would imagine this is fairly representative in a lot of places. But again, these numbers, I think, like I said, kind of validate what we probably already suspect. And these are not necessarily career-oriented jobs, but as I mentioned earlier, they're important nonetheless. They provide the work experiences that are important because they, again, expose. For a lot of people, it's young people, it's their first exposure to the workplace. I would also add that that these are two, retail and food service are two of the sectors kind of most impacted by the pandemic. And so employment opportunities for younger folks were more limited in 2020 and 2021. And that helps explain, why we saw that, when we're looking at the current population survey, that really big dip that occurred in the national numbers, and why, the employment numbers were so much lower for folks, say 16 to 19 than they were for the workforce overall, the labor force overall. Now, shifting to the pie chart on the right, that's when we can look at what happens. Well, when students get to that 19 to 21 year old, they leave high school. Well, what happens when they get to 19 to 21 years old? And that's where you start to see the shift. Retail remains a quarter of the employment, but the share of workers in accommodation and food services really kind of shrinks from half to about a quarter of all employment. And in its place, you begin to see more people going into industries that offer like greater career opportunities. So things like healthcare, for instance, becomes all of a sudden goes from 4% to over 12% of the workforce, in manufacturing and construction. And these industries, let's go back. These industries often provide different places to for people to enter who may have a high school degree or a high school degree with some additional training. They tend to have these industries tend to have pathways to more middle skill jobs, or jobs that can be secured with more experience, or that may require some kind of industry certification or maybe a 2-year degree. So you can see that kind of the path that the kind of how the number of options change over time. Now, again, taking a little bit, that was the last, those was the average of the last kind of 4 quarters that are available, but those trends tend to stay fairly consistent. And so, the prominence of young people working in accommodation and food services remains notable. And the QWI can also help us show that these sectors have been kind of far and away the leading employers of young people for a long time. So what this chart shows is a 4-quarter rolling average of employment in food service and retail for 14 to 18 year olds, which are the purple lines, and then 19 to 21 year olds, which are the green lines, and that's going back to the past 2 decades at the beginning of the century. And what you see is the overall decline in the number of 14 to 18 year olds from where it was in 2000, with a big decline, kind of similar to some of the earlier charts that we saw occurring during the Great Recession. And so it's still down from where it was in terms of 14 to 18 year olds working in accommodation and food services, and then also in retail. And then for the 19 to 21 year olds, it's been a little bit more steady. As those opportunities have come back, certainly in kind of more recently, as we recover from the pandemic, you begin to see the change in food service and retail for 14 to 18 year olds, and you can see it's kind of coming back up with the recovery. Whereas when we look at the 19 to 21 year olds, there was a decline in food service and accommodation that occurred, and doesn't have the same bounce back in that last quarter. So it may be a little bit early to tell if that's how that what that trend looks like going forward. But my general the way I generally tend to think about this, I guess, is to think about like, well, what's going on here? And I tend to think a lot of this goes back to those demographic shifts I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. And we also hear, about labor shortages and the Great Resignation. And I think really what's more of a reshuffling of the labor force. And there are fewer people in the labor force as a result of the demand for labor has increased. And a lot of people now are able, who are fully in the workforce at least, not just kind of working part-time like a high school student might, but for those people who are fully in the labor force, are now able to find more stable jobs that maybe better paying, that maybe have better hours than they might have before the pandemic. And so they're not necessarily returning to food service in the way that they might have in the past. And so that goes for like the 19 to 20 or 21-year-olds, for instance. And now, since it's harder for employers in food service to find workers, they need to pay higher wages, and that's likely maybe drawing in kind of more young people into the labor force than they might have before, because there's just more opportunities for them. So that's at least my working hypothesis. And like I said, when we get more current data, we'll be able to know a little bit more. Now, again, putting these trends through the kind of the geography filter can help add some additional insights as well. And so the map on the left shows the sector in each county that employs the greatest share of 14 to 18-year-olds in that county. So basically, going back to the pie chart that I showed 2 slides ago, this is showing what's the biggest piece of the pie for each county for 14 to 18-year-olds. And it shows that in most Missouri counties, the leading employer of young people in each county is food service and accommodation. And again, that kind of aligns with, exactly what you would expect it to be. And then in a handful of counties, predominantly rural counties, retail was the leading employer of 14 to 18-year-olds. But just as with the pie charts, the picture shifts again as we look at the 19 to 21-year-olds, and we see more workers going into a kind of a more diverse set of activities. As in some counties, there were more people working in things like manufacturing and healthcare than just food service or retail. And so this is an area where the kind of the benefit of having some kind of local knowledge is, in terms of interpreting what the data mean or what's there, is that I know that, for instance, in several of these counties, that are in several of these counties, they're very rural, and in some cases they have very large like meat and food processing facilities that are those counties' largest employers, or at least one of their largest counties. So up in northern, kind of north central Missouri, in Sullivan County, Smithfield has a very large food processing facility. Down in the far southwest corner of Missouri, which is McDonald County, Tyson has a lot of chicken processing facilities. We're right close to Arkansas, right there. And then kind of over in southeast Missouri, in Stoddard County, Tyson and Nestle Purina have large facilities there. In other places, we can see where retail kind of starts to pop out a little bit more. Camden County is the Lake of the Ozarks, and then down in Taney County, down here is Branson. So those, again, lead to different types of opportunities. So really the big takeaway here is that the types of opportunities available to those in those the types of local employment opportunities available can often dictate where young people, particularly those who are electing to fully enter the workforce, go to work. If you're staying home and you want to enter the workforce and the main employer is a large manufacturing plant, then that's where you may end up working. And you can see how it shifts the patterns of youth employment. Now, just getting to wrap up here a bit, rather than just kind of talk about these trends, I'd like to just leave with some thoughts about ways to understand and support youth employment, whether it's kind of in our communities or in our own, workplaces, with some thoughts about, how to support youth employment and work-based learning more generally. And there are a lot of factors that can affect the trajectory that young people take, and also, a lot of ways to help guide them on that path. And these, initiatives, they often involve varying degrees of kind of intensity or duration in terms of the way that you interact with folks. So the graphic that I have here is one that I took out of a November 2020 report that the folks at the Brookings Institution pulled together about work-based learning. And I actually think it's a pretty instructive graphic, and the report itself is a pretty good primer on, work-based learning and kind of youth employment. But I think it's instructive in just showing the range of possible actions. So as we go from left to right, at the most basic level, we have things where we learn about career awareness, and that can be through career fairs or career speakers coming into schools, and just it's a short-term interaction with students to just introduce them to what are the opportunities that are out there. As we kind of increase the level of engagement that's there, we move into career exploration, and that may be doing things like job shadowing or just kind of a more a deeper engagement with students about helping them explore different opportunities. When you start to move, and they call it the relationship zone, you can move into things like internships or pre-apprenticeships, and that's where where students are working on actual like practical projects. They're actually like interacting with and developing relationships with people in the workforce or employers. And so, it helps students build some of those kind of basic kind of skills. And then finally, the most kind of intensive form of interaction is, would be, in career training, where you're actually like involved in the process of training for a career as opposed to just exploring it. And that may be through like registered apprenticeships and those kind of things. So, I mean, I think those things are all important. And certainly, things like career awareness is obviously best started in, certainly at least at the beginning of middle school to help set people on their track. But how, being, if we want to have workers, if we're employers and we want to have workers, we need to engage in these kinds of activities. And as parents or educators, we also need to make sure that people get those opportunities. Now, there's one thing to be, have these opportunities, to have the experience, but you also want to have people have a high quality experience as well. And I think there are certain things to keep in mind. If you are, working with students, or you are working with people in your community who are working with students, to keep these things in mind. And that's, are these connected experiences? This is basically, are they tying what they are learning in school to what they're doing in the workplace? So they can see the connection of why they're bothering to learn something. Are students being given meaningful tasks? Are they being given a real project to work on, or are they being asked to just run errands or make copies or kind of menial tasks that don't necessarily help them really kind of learn? Are they connecting them to networks? I mean, one of the and this is the kind of adult youth relationship thing, is that one of the even if you are working in a job that's not necessarily a career oriented job, the benefit of having an employer who can write you a letter of recommendation for the next job should not be discounted. So, making sure you build those, relationships. There's always also important, for young people to make sure that they receive feedback on how they did and how they can improve and what things they might need to work on going forward. And then the last two things are, one of the, they go hand in hand. And I'll go to the first, the one of, in terms of compensation. I always believe that, you pay people for their work. And the types of people who can afford to do free internships are the people who do free internships are the people who can afford to do free internships. So it's really disadvantageous for people from kind of poor households. And so it's, in other words, pay people if you're going to have them as internships, because that also ties in a little bit, and just in terms of the access to opportunity, is that like if they're not being paid, oftentimes there's challenges on that supportive services in terms of transportation and getting people there, and in terms of having the flexibility with schools and all these sort of things, these kind of supportive services. So long story short, pay your interns. Anyway, with that, I'll wrap up here before we take some questions with just a few kind of just key takeaways. And that I think as we think about youth employment, we need to, keep those demographic shifts in mind, because they're really driving kind of the changing nature of the workforce and the types of opportunities that are available. The last few years have made things there's all sorts of things that have occurred over the course of the last few years. And so the economic consequences of the pandemic really, I think, affected the sectors that were most likely to employ young people. And, you know, we can start to see recovery in those sectors. And they're starting to create opportunities for people as we recover. So that's a good thing. You know, economic and geographic factors can influence just the nature and extent of the types of opportunities available to people, either through education, but also just, you know, what types of youth employment opportunities are available to them. I think all employment opportunities provide valuable life experiences, especially if employers ensure that they are quality work experiences. And then also, you know, I would like to always, you know, make sure we make a point of giving all the credit in the world to the folks who work in our statistical agencies like the Census Bureau, the State Labor Market Information, LMI agencies, and state departments of education that, you know, that provide us with a lot of valuable data that can help us understand a whole host of issues, including youth employment. And if you haven't, you know, if you don't know your state LMI agency, get to know them. And then also, you know, it probably doesn't hurt to get to know your State Department of Education as well. So with that, hopefully this was enough to spur your interest in these topics. Just as kind of background, we developed these information not out of a kind of a larger research project on youth employment, but it's so it wasn't part of this exhaustive research project, but it was part of our extension mission to push information out of the university and get it into the, you know, kind of the hands of the general public who can use it. So what I presented here kind of was initially developed as part of what we call our Missouri Economy Indicator Series, which is a series of briefs we release every 3 weeks. And these briefs tackle a variety of different topics and data sources, and the data kind of made available through the LEHD program has certainly been incredibly helpful in our efforts. For instance, one of our kind of more recent briefs looked at changes in commuting between 2002 and 2019 using the loads data. So, you know, there's all sorts of stuff that can be mined, and we try to use those sources for our kind of short 2-page brief. So if you're interested in Missouri, and why wouldn't you be, or are looking for topics that, you know, might be of interest to people in your state, because again, everything that I've kind of presented here can be, I think, mostly easily replicated in other states. Then you might consider subscribing to our MEI series. So please subscribe to our newsletter. In the meantime, I'll stop here, and so please feel free to ask some questions.
Thank you, Mark. Before we get to the questions in the Q&A, we received a few questions and comments regarding the presentation, which will be accessible on the Census Academy website in a week or two at census.gov/academy under the webinar tab. So we have a couple of comments here. One is that I like the high quality experience. This conversation needs to be expanded. Another comment is, Mark, you make some really good points about how to build an impactful program. So kudos.
Well, I think that's, you know, one of the, I guess the one response I would have to that is it's kind of nice to leave people with some, you know, it's nice to know that these are, you know, that we have, you know, the nature and extent of young people working in our workforce. But I think there's always action steps that can be taken. And so it's, whether it's in our, you know, in our workplace or our community or whatnot, you know, there's things that can be done. And pay your interns.
Okay, another one is great presentation. I particularly like the relationship between education and the workforce. Have you started using the PSEO?
Yes, we have seen it. We've played with it a little bit, and some of that we have like an internal audience here because of being at an institution of higher ed. And so, yeah, we looked at some of the things that of the PSEO that's most interesting to me is what share of students stay in the state. You know, so here at Mizzou, we keep about, although 65% or so of our students stay in Missouri, kind of after graduating. There's other state institutions like that's part of the University of Missouri system, like University of Missouri at St. Louis, where it's closer to 90% because it's a much more kind of regionally serving institution. And then, at the other end of the continuum, we have our, University of Missouri S&T, Science and Technology, which is like our engineering institution, which is in Rolla, Missouri. And that's the numbers are like, I think in the 40s, because we have a lot of, they have a lot of foreign students as well that come in. So it's all very interesting to us, because as you think about, when you do any kind of like labor force study and you're trying to say, oh, well, we have all these graduates coming out of these institutions. Well, you're not capturing all those students. And, so as I think was mentioned in the introduction, we did work earlier this year for an industry group in St. Louis, Bio St. Louis, which is kind of an industry group for the, the biotech industry in St. Louis. And, there, when you're looking at the, the institutions that are really pumping out people in terms of like engineering and some of the hard sciences, it's like Washington University and St. Louis University, and they're private institutions, but you look at where their students coming from. And so many of those students come from like not in St. Louis or in Missouri. They're really from all over the place. And so, it's you as a region, we want to be able to try and capture more of their graduates if we can, so that, as kind of the St. Louis region needs to think about how do we start developing a relationship with the students at WashU or St. Louis University earlier than we do, before they've made a decision about what they're doing when they're graduating. How do you, as employers, do you develop those relationships? How as a region or a community, how do you, get those students to look at the St. Louis area as, a place where they live, as opposed to a place where they just go to school. And so I think the PSEO data can really help inform some of those kind of conversations. So the answer is yes, we've looked at it, and yes, we like it. So thank you, LEHD program, for yet another really great data tool.
Another question, great information. Is it available for other states?
You could put this together for other states. The information that we put together is for Missouri, because that's our kind of our audience and our constituency. But there's really nothing in here, I don't think, that could not be replicated in other states. You might need to, on the kind of in terms of like what what people do when they graduate from high school questions, that you might want to, have a conversation with someone at your state, Department of Secondary Education. But, everything else is coming from, the, ACS and QWI and the current population survey and, stuff that's available for all places around the country.
Okay. What are your age breaks for baby boomers, Gen X, millennial, and Gen Z? And I agree, Gen X is always left behind. Yes,
that's right. We are the forgotten generation. We're too busy getting the work done. I'm going to scroll back really quick, because I had in one of these slides, I had in my notes, I had written down. So basically, I don't have the exact years, but again, the boomers, the youngest boomers are in their late 50s right now. And then Gen X runs from sometime in the 60s to 1980. And so we're in that 40 to 55 range. And then I'm 73 for what it's worth, smack dab in the middle of the Gen Xers. And then the millennials, the millennial generation runs from like 1980 to 1996 or so, and then Gen Z is kind of after that.
Thank you. Great presentation. Do you have data for youth employment and their driver status? Their driver status and access to vehicles seem to play a role in employment too.
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't have information on that, but it really speaks to, when I guess on, on this slide, when we're talking about like supportive services, like the transportation piece is a really big one, because it really influences the extent to which people can take advantage of the opportunities that are there. And I mean, that matters for everyone in the workforce, in terms of access to transportation or public transportation, whether private or having reliable transportation, but it's especially important for young people. So no, I don't have information on that, but it's a very important consideration.
Thank you. Were you able to get the LEHD, the QWI data from the QWI Explorer? Or did you have to work with the microdata or a custom extract?
I use the QWI extraction tool, and then kind of dumped everything out, and then dumped it into Excel and used a kind of a pivot table to kind of get out what I wanted. So that's another helpful. I mean, I'm so old. I remember when the QWI data were running on something that looked like straight out of like 1995. And that was really tedious to get it. So, you know, whether it's the QWI Explorer or that kind of the extraction tool, those have been great kind of tools that have been developed to make just accessing this information a lot easier. So that's what that's how I pulled it.
Okay, thank you. That concludes our questions at this time. Are there any further questions?
Actually, there is one in the Q&A. Did you read that one, Tanja?
Let me see. I thought I saw
I can
them all.
read it.
Am I missing one? Yeah, I didn't see it. I don't see it.
All right. So the question is, do you have a sense of how many young workers are enrolled in the post-secondary education programs while working, and whether the share varies from that of older workers?
So in other words, how many people are? Yeah, I don't have numbers on how many are both working and going to school, because there certainly is overlap that we know, but I don't have. I think it's, you know, I think a lot of when you see some of the information, I think that's like their primary, where their focus is in terms of what they're doing, whether it's 4-year, 2-year employment. But there's, you know, I think it is an important caveat to mention that those boundaries are probably pretty fuzzy.
Are there any further questions? Okay, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank you for joining us this afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Mark White, for your excellent presentation. Mark, would you like to say anything else in closing?
No, just thank you. You know, thank you for having me. This is great, and you know, I appreciate. Like I said, I've been a long time user of LED data, so it's really kind of exciting to see kind of how the program's grown over time. So, thank you all for taking the time to listen.
Thank you again to everyone. An evaluation will be mailed to you following this webinar. We would appreciate if you took the time to complete the short survey so that we may better serve you. Please join us next month on Wednesday, June 15th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, when Patrick Hewitt will present Providing Local Communities with the Data They Need. Until next time, thank you for spending your afternoon with us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for your participation. You may disconnect at this time.